Hi everyone, and welcome to CP 600, Child and Adolescent Counseling. I'm excited to work with you guys in this class, and since we've worked together before, I thought that I would try to capitalize on your energy and creativity in the classroom and structure the class so that we have more hands-on time with the material. So what I'd like to do is have you guys review PowerPoints prior to coming in for class, and that way you've got the lecture content fresh in your mind. When you come to class, we're going to work hard to make the content meaningful through different activities. Sometimes I'll have videos for us to watch. Sometimes we'll be exploring our case studies and applying the new material to the case studies. One thing that I would like to mention here is that these PowerPoints are my own study notes, and sometimes I will quote directly from the text. Please know that all of the contents from the slides is coming out of your textbooks. As you can see here, this first module has 5 chapters in it, so I've recorded brief lectures for each of the chapters. We'll get started with Chapter 1 now. In Chapter 1, you'll read about markers of effective child clinicians. First, to be an effective child clinician, there are certain qualifications that you might choose to pursue. For you guys, your training will prepare you for working with children as licensed mental health counselors. Some of you might be planning to pursue the additional educational requirements that will also qualify you to become licensed as marriage and family therapists. Regardless of your professional aspirations, there are certain courses and experiences that are required before you'll be qualified to work with children. This class is the first step. Working with children is very different than working with adults. There are certain personal traits that will allow you to be more successful as a counselor, regardless of the population that you serve, which is one reason that the program here at City U really stresses self-awareness and reflection. As you guys move into client work soon, start to pay attention to these things in yourself. In this list, you will notice traits that might be true of counselors working with any population, so I will just highlight a few here that I know to be especially important when working with children. First, I would say that an open-minded approach is probably one of the most important components on this list. In working with children at different developmental stages, figuring out ways to meet them where they are and facilitating a therapeutic relationship starts here. Alongside this is the need to respect the child. I think it's easy to disregard this notion because the child is younger and dependent. I would say that this is precisely the reason that we need to show respect for the child. He or she may not have very many freedoms in life and may not have opportunity to make choices for themselves. An open-minded and respectful attitude, allowing the child to develop self-confidence and autonomy, will set the stage for the therapeutic relationship. Additionally, I believe that genuineness or being true to oneself is also an important building block for the therapeutic relationship. Whenever a child is coming to see you, chances are good that the child has some difficulty in life and may not trust adults outright. In my own work with children, exposing my humanity through appropriate self-disclosure seems to strengthen the relationship as well. Also, one issue that we will discuss with regularity this quarter is that of how to work with parents. The first thing for you to remember is that they deserve your respect too. Next, Brims discussed a number of reactions that counselors may experience when working with children. It will be especially important for you to seek out supervision when you work with children because of the potential for countertransferences and identifications. A certain level of attachment is not a bad thing. When working with children, however, really strong attachments will most likely interfere with treatment. Countertransferences are also not necessarily bad, as you know. The most important piece here is your own self-awareness. Brims discussed 4 different types of countertransferences: issue-specific, stimulus-specific, trait-specific, and child-specific. Issue-specific countertransference results from some issue the child brings to counseling, maybe sexual abuse, for example, that is a sensitive or anxiety-producing issue for the counselor. Stimulus-specific countertransference is independent of the child's needs, feelings, or behavior, but rather occurs in response to an external, treatment-irrelevant stimulus of the child. Brims described an example of this as a counselor who has unresolved issues of sibling rivalry might respond to children who remind him or her of a sibling. The issue is not specific to the child, it is an external stimulus, like the gender of the child. Trait-specific countertransference indicates that the counselor is responding to a certain aspect or trait of the child. This response is the same response that the counselor would project regardless of the circumstances. Maybe the counselor is an atheist and responds negatively whenever people talk about God or want to pray. If a client, particularly a child, has a need to talk about God and the counselor reacted in a negative way, this might impact treatment. The final type of countertransference is child-specific countertransference. I'd say that this could be called client-specific, as this is the same type of countertransference which you'll find when working with adults. This type of countertransference can provide you with insights into how the child is perceived by others in his or her environment. If you, as the counselor, become frustrated with a certain character trait of the child, then there is a chance that others become frustrated similarly. In addition to countertransferences, Brims discussed identifications and their place in the therapeutic relationship. First, identification with the child implies that the counselor is empathically in tune with the client, but the counselor has also lost perspective and begins to relate to the child's environment as the child would. This is especially important to consider in light of the relationship between counselor and parents. Remember, you must retain an empathic stance with the parents too. Second, projective identification happens whenever a child attempts to project an unacceptable or frightening aspect of the self onto the counselor. This can have a positive or a negative impact depending upon the awareness of the counselor. If the counselor can receive the projection and meet it with acceptance, then the outcome is likely to be positive. If, however, the counselor receives the projective identification but does not recognize it as the child's, then the outcome is likely to be negative. This concept is a bit more obscure, so let's talk about it in class if you feel like you have some questions. In some instances, counselors might experience identification with the parents. If this happens, then the counselor might lose the ability to empathize with their client in an appropriate way as they become aligned with the adults. Reactive identification is just the opposite when the counselor disagrees with the parents and attempts to be different from them. This is potentially damaging too, as the potential for a therapeutic atmosphere is impacted. It is critically important for counselors who work with children to have a high level of self-awareness, as the potential to cause harm when working with an identified vulnerable population is high. A lot of times I'll hear counselors, especially young counselors, talk about how they want to work with children because they don't feel as if they are mature enough yet to be taken seriously by adult clients. I would say this is not a good reason to go into work with children. Brims also discussed a number of vulnerabilities that child counselors might face. For me, I know myself well enough to know that I would be quite likely to fall into the role of rescuer. This was a difficult part of my work at the domestic violence shelter. I ran a children's program there, and so many times I would become frustrated with the child's parent or guardian and how that person's own mental health issues were impacting the client's growth and progress in treatment. Just as is true of countertransferences, it is on you to explore your desires for working with children and to be prepared to work through these in your own counseling. When working with children, I can assure you that you will experience frustrations with the parents. Sometimes your frustrations might be because of a feeling of helplessness in response to the child's circumstances. In these circumstances, remember that sympathy alone is not therapeutic. Protecting a child from exploring painful memories and experiences is not going to help the child. At other times, if a child is a victim of abuse, then the counselor may find it difficult to develop an empathic relationship with the parents. At other times still, the counselor might find it difficult to believe that the parent, whom they've met and have an alliance with, might be guilty of mistreating their child. In either of these cases, remember that you cannot respond to anyone out of your habitual values. You must remember that parents who demonstrate abusive behavior were most likely abused themselves, and it is your ethical duty to not make judgments based on your own value system. Brims summed this up by saying that each individual child and family member must be assessed carefully to assure that the understanding of them is based in reality, not countertransference. Brims also included discussion of 6 relational patterns that were originally named by Paul Adams in 1982. These are the true faith healer, meaning I have the one and only answer to all of your problems. The me, adult, you, child pattern, meaning the child is automatically disadvantaged in the relationship because of their lesser status. The good enough parent countertransference, meaning that I will parent you since your parents haven't. The big sibling countertransference, meaning I will avoid any of the real issues and just provide guidance. The babysitter pattern, meaning I am responsible for your welfare and all of your interactions in the playroom. While the child might have fun in treatment, the watchfulness of the counselor has not promoted any self-awareness or growth for the child. The teacher relationship pattern is also non-therapeutic. The focus of the counselor in this pattern is one of didactic instruction. Remember that the counselor-client relationship is not focused on new knowledge acquisition, it's focused on self-awareness and growth. As I mentioned earlier, we'll spend a good bit of time discussing how to work with parents. Bryn's outlined a number of important considerations for us here, and I would hope that you can keep these in mind as you begin your client work and understand that some of the frustrations you will experience are common and not necessarily as a result of your status as an intern or a new professional. Throughout your work with families, remember that you will be triggered by events that are similar to your own experiences, and you will be faced with parents who will challenge you. It's your ethical duty to pay attention to these things inside yourself and figure out ways that you can remain therapeutically neutral in the relationship so that the whole family is strengthened. Finally, Bryn's discussed a number of issues to consider when working with children based on their unique needs. One thing that drives my thinking whenever I'm working with children is that they do not, as a rule, have the cognitive capacity to process information in the same way as I do. How I choose to approach the child because of this is from a position of curiosity. I want to understand what actions, words, and emotions mean from his or her perspective, not from my perspective. Remember, play is a child's work. Observing a child at play will provide you with a unique perspective into the child's world. Pay attention to the use of metaphor during play. Many times, a child is not psychologically safe enough to overtly discuss the manifest content of a metaphor. For example, a dinosaur might represent Dad. Talk to the child about the dinosaur, not about Dad. Be aware of developmental milestones. We will start discussing these in Chapter 3, but knowledge of typical development will allow you to be sensitive to the child's abilities and any fluctuations in affect. For example, being able to hold on to more than one emotional state at the same time is not a typical childhood skill. Hence, you may see children laughing one minute and crying the next. As always, be aware of your own emotional reactions. Children tend to evoke strong emotions in us. Set up strategies for yourself as to how you will balance these emotional responses. All right, that's it for Chapter 1. Your next presentation will pick up with slide number 11, and we'll discuss cultural sensitivity in working with children.